The oppression paradox. Hey, it's Prince of Queens, and this video will be a bit of a follow-up to a video I made several months ago called The Privilege Paradox, though it should be of note that this was inspired by thoughts from one of my oldest subscribers and my absolute most consistent patron, a user that goes by the name of Illiterati, who I will be fortunate enough to meet this summer when he visits from Australia. He wrote to me a few weeks ago about his visit, speaking about growing up gay probably in the 1990s and the 2000s in Australia, saying, "We fought hard for our community only to see entitled little C-word grow up entitled and take over it, believing themselves to be more oppressed than we ever would have thought." He was presumably speaking about the little non-binaries and feminists that have now taken over gay culture, and I realized that I related to this very strongly in a way that he likely didn't even suspect, as I feel the exact same way as a gay man that grew up in the 1990s, when it was still relatively taboo to be an open homosexual in most aspects of American culture, including in the workplace and certainly in school, where a huge portion of the guys I knew were bullied and then literally victim blamed by their school administration for acting too queer or whatever. When we were young, we faced severe strife as homosexual men in the 1990s or as trans women who were still identifying as male. This strife could easily be described as oppression, though I like to avoid using the word due to its intertwinement with intersectional feminists and whatever vague version of neo-Marxists are out there in the current year. Regardless, this strife we suffered simply became a fact of life for people like myself by the time I was 14 or so, and I legitimately didn't ever think it would go away. It was only until I was about 23 or so that I began coming up with weird homosexual supremacist fantasies about a future world where all breeding was controlled and deliberately concocted by the population, and gay men were privileged or something. However, by the time I was in my late 20s, I was entirely tired of even talking about gay male politics at all. And while I never got tired of talking about being gay, because really, most gay guys never do, as I think that's just part of being any type of minority, I basically gave up thinking at all about the idea that I was oppressed by being gay. Certainly by the time gay marriage was legalized in California in 2014 when I was living in San Francisco. That said, with all of the blatantly anti-gay sentiments in the 1990s, like the fear of AIDS, general gay jokes, blatant discrimination that we'd face from relatively normal people, sodomy laws, people being fired from work, etc. for being gay, there was a very sizable population of gay men who did end up basing seemingly their entire identity around the fact that they were gay men. Now, don't get me wrong, as the Prince of all Queens myself, I would be a downright liar if I were to say that people of any minority group should somehow pretend that they are never going to mention their minority status if they can avoid it. Because unless you are feeling a need to hide what you are, why hide what you are? Or worse, you could be the token gay guy that doesn't make a big deal about the fact that he's gay and acts totally normal. Maybe it sounds like a fairly okay approach from afar, but what it means, of course, is having almost exclusively straight friends and finding a way to remind seemingly every typical gay male of the fact that you are not a typical gay man if you're ever forced to be around a typical gay man, or whatever. That specific type of straight-acting gay guy is a tedious and embarrassing trope that homos have been dealing with for as far back as we can remember, I assure you. And if you ever end up finding yourself dating these guys, which I have on more than one occasion, they always end up having major issues and getting uncomfortable when you start acting gay around their straight friends or some dumb crap, which is just a waste of time. The only way to be happy dating one is to be one, which is, I guess, how they all meet each other on phone applications with the mask for mask thing. Regardless, the point I'm trying to make is that my life as a gay guy isn't a huge deal to me. Though, is it an issue? Yes. Is it something that I'll continue to talk about? Yes. Is it something that gives me an inherent camaraderie with other gay men? Yes. But I've gotten used to all of that for over a decade, and it simply is what it is. And I don't feel any urge to whine about it. That all being said about my own minority status, I feel as if I've observed the same exact thing from other minority communities. For example, I've observed the same type of thing from black people who certainly talk about being black and the differences between white people, black people, and sometimes even the differences between Asian people and black people. But in the end, it's not to necessarily claim any sort of politicized oppression. It's just part of how black people relate to each other. Thus, the following is what I'm calling the oppression paradox. If anybody is familiar with the work of Jonathan Haidt, who is the co-author of the book The Coddling of the American Mind, one of the things he's made it a big point to point out is that the concept of microaggressions only present themselves in extremely egalitarian and typically left-leaning environments. Long story short, it's only after people are no longer facing any sort of substantive discrimination for their minority or allegedly oppressed status that they begin searching for subtle and generally unintentional ways of being offended by innocuous questions like, "Where are you from, Mr. Asian person? I mean, not like your city, as you're clearly from the United States based on your accent. I want to know where you are really from. Are you from Chingchong, China, or the fill me up with dog meat Philippines?" All jokes aside, anybody who has spent time in far leftist environments like universities or cities like Seattle or San Francisco, and then has also gone out of their way to converse with people who aren't drinking that type of Kool-Aid, such as people on YouTube or those who play team games like Call of Duty or Overwatch, if you've conversed with both types like I have, you can attest to the exact same thing. It's only in environments where people are expected by social norms and even authoritarian rules to treat people without racial, gender, religious, or sexual preference bias in which people complain about being oppressed or some sort of negative bias. But everywhere else in the world, where people legitimately do experience racism, sexism, or anti-LGBT things fairly regularly, people rarely ever bring up whether or not this is a problem to them. That's why I call this a paradox. The notion is that it's basically almost exclusively people who aren't really discriminated against who complain about being discriminated against a whole bunch. And really, as I think about this even rung true with gay men in the 1990s and early 2000s. You see, I was one of the gay guys that had both straight and gay friends, and since I didn't want to annoy my straight friends by whining about how hard it is to be a gay guy, I generally talked about such things when I was either exclusively around gay men or with the few female friends we'd hand select. However, there were guys that did speak about homophobia and safe sex or whatever so often that it was likely a literal occupation for them, and these are the type of guys that I now call gay church ladies, though it was back in the 1990s. And when I think about it, I have to wonder if these people were really oppressed by being gay even in the 1990s. You see, the more I think about it, I realize that their gayness was really about the only thing they had going for them, which is why they based their entire social life and often their employment around it, and thus, it would be dishonest to say that these guys were disadvantaged by being gay, because it's not like they ever really interacted with straight people anyway. They weren't exactly a gay rapper in the 1990s. Oh wait, I don't think anybody was a gay rapper in the 1990s. That being said, the more I think about it, this oppression paradox absolutely extends to every minority group. Racial minorities, for example, are by no means any exception. You see, I've always noticed that Asian people who face obstacles in generally white environments and don't benefit socially by tokenizing themselves as a person of color are extremely guarded about ever discussing their hardships based around their minority status as Asians. They don't want to talk about it. However, in the far left, when there is something to be gained by blathering on and on about how hard it is to deal with being treated like you are an invisible Asian man or being tokenized as an exotic Asian woman, when these people are dealing with white leftists, and maybe even some black leftists, they'll yell from the rooftops, "White supremacy put my grandfather in an internment camp. Black lives matter. I stand against anti-blackness. How absolutely dare you ask me where I'm from?" Finally, one of the funniest things about the oppression paradox, of course, is, well, the funniest thing about literally any discussion that you can have about oppression, which would be, you've guessed it.
I feel like for the first time in a long time, I feel optimistic. It's the first day that I've had that like optimistic feeling come back to me. I think like a lot of people sort of since election day have been walking around with this like pit in my stomach, and just feeling horrible, you know, because I knew it was bad. I do this work. I write about these issues every day. I know how much misogyny is out there. I know that women are hated. But I didn't think it was that bad. I didn't think it was that bad, and I'm regretting not sort of being more clear-eyed on that. And one of the things that the book is about is the impact of a lifetime of misogyny on women, right? Like this cumulative effect of everything from like the small microaggressions, the small slights, the everyday slights, to the bigger assaults, the harassment, and sort of what it all does to us. And we haven't necessarily had this conversation about what it means, what it does to us emotionally and psychologically to live in a world that hates women. And after the election, and I'm betting a lot of you have stories like this, a lot of the women I knew were getting sick. Like, they were nauseous all the time. I mean, like, literally physically sick, having migraines. I had a friend who had never had a pimple in her life all of a sudden, like, break out in acne. I got shingles, which I didn't know that you could get if you were 38 years old, but apparently you can. And it was just like this physical manifestation, right, of the stress and the trauma that's been done. And it's interesting because it's sort of the feeling that I wanted to get to in this book. This feeling that we're having right now. And while I do want to talk about sort of what comes next, and I think the march is such a great start for that.
That's Jessica Valenti, and on behalf of literally every man and woman on Earth that isn't gifted with all of the countless tangible systemic female privileges that the Western world has afforded to females exclusively, not to mention the more vague and elusive social benefits women tend to receive, I want to tell her, guess what, Cupcake? That feeling of sickness wasn't a feeling that things are still bad for you in spite of the progress that you thought was made. Rather, that feeling of sickness is nothing more than you not getting what you want and wanting to throw an adult temper tantrum when culture at large finally tells you privileged and beyond entitled upper middle class white girls, no more. As a culture, we've given you literally everything we could for over 50 years, and all you've done is spit in our faces, belittle every male you ever come into contact with, and made every woman around you as miserable as you are by telling her that she can have both a happy family as well as a fulfilling career, when clearly feminist women almost unanimously end up with neither, and the women who end up with one or two or kinda even both aren't feminists and act nothing like you. We told you no, take no for an answer, stop looking shocked. Yes, it must absolutely make these women sick to realize that their entire career, and more than often their lives, were built around an assumption of disadvantage by being female, which was the worst type of lie. A lie that proclaims the exact opposite of the truth. But that's exactly what the oppression paradox really is. The oppression paradox is what happens when people who either used to be oppressed or disadvantaged in some tangible way, but aren't in the current context and maybe haven't been in, hundreds of years, if ever, decide to build an entire identity around their alleged oppression, which, as fate will lead them to, will always come to an end because eventually people will figure out their hustle and those people will stop feeding the troll. Instead, I suggest that these people give their money, food, and attention to the oppressed population that does deserve some help. Men. And those who seek to make lives better for men, who are honestly usually people who make a lot less noise than I do with all my videos, as these people are shy. Which is a shame because part of the oppression paradox is that it's a squeaky wheel that gets the grease, and people have a foolish tendency to believe that those who complain most publicly and regularly are those who need the most help. As if there's no such thing as an activist industry. I hope this video made you feel satisfied in some sort of cathartic way, or maybe even motivational way. And if it did, I'm always taking tips on PayPal so I can continue making this type of work. Thanks a bunch. I'll see you later.